It was supposed to be just another peaceful day in the park for Mrs. Marjorie, an elderly woman looking for a bit of quiet time to relax and reflect. But when she encountered a police officer with dark intentions, her sense of safety was completely shattered. Follow along as courage and justice shine through in this powerful, resilient story. You won't want to miss a moment of this journey. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your support inspires us to share more meaningful stories. Mrs. Marjorie, an elderly black woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, had a deep love for the city's Central Park. To many, it was just a place to stroll or gather, but for her, it was a part of her life, intertwined with precious memories of her son. Captain James Thurston. Every weekend, she would walk through the park, hoping to see her son while he was on duty, or simply to feel that he was somewhere nearby, quietly watching over everyone and protecting her. Mrs. Marjorie walked slowly along the small stone path, breathing in the fresh morning air. Green tree branches swayed in the light breeze, and sunlight peeked through the leaves, casting shimmering patterns. She always loved the feeling of peace that came with being in this quiet space, where all her weariness seemed to fade away, leaving only tranquility in her soul. Each step she took was filled with memories of her son, whom she was immensely proud of. Captain James Thompson, her only son, had been a kind and courageous child from an early age. Mrs. Marjorie fondly remembered the days when young James would run around the park, picking tiny wildflowers to bring back as special gifts for her. Those memories were so deeply etched that even now, as James had grown into a brave and responsible police officer, she could still see the image of her little boy in every corner of the park. Since James had joined the police force and was assigned to patrol the park, it had become even more special to her. She would often reassure herself, "With James here, I'm always safe." That thought was a comforting reminder of the protection her son provided, the son she trusted completely, who had chosen a path to uphold justice and peace for the community. Whenever she caught a glimpse of him in his police uniform from afar, her heart swelled with indescribable pride. She never wanted to interrupt his work, but sometimes just a look or a small smile from him was enough to make her day. That day, Mrs. Marjorie decided to visit the park once more. She chose a simple outfit with a light blue scarf, the color her son always said looked good on her. She walked with quiet joy, hoping that today she might catch a glimpse of him from a distance or even exchange a few words. Every weekend she came here, she carried a small hope for an unexpected encounter, a touch of warmth to strengthen her in life. She walked slowly, savoring each moment in the familiar space. She watched happy families on the lush green lawns, the laughter of children echoing like a familiar melody. Each time she saw such scenes, she thought of her young James, memories that always soften her heart, filling it with warmth and love. But Mrs. Marjorie couldn't know that today would be unlike any other visit. Today, she would face the greatest challenge she had ever imagined in the very park she loved so dearly. Walking to a quieter area, where smaller paths cut through dense shrubbery, Mrs. Marjorie stopped to rest on a stone bench. She sat there, enjoying the quiet moment with her eyes closed, listening to the rustling leaves and the gentle scent of greenery. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes and saw a police officer standing there, someone she hadn't seen before. He stood right in front of her, his gaze cold and hostile, giving her a sense of foreboding. "Hello there," the officer said, but it wasn't a friendly greeting. His tone was curt and mocking, making Mrs. Marjorie immediately feel something was wrong. She tried to smile politely and replied, "Hello." "Well, who are you to be walking around here so freely?" he asked with a smirk. Mrs. Marjorie was a little surprised by the question but responded gently, "I'm just here visiting my son. He's on duty here." At her reply, the officer's expression shifted from indifference to clear disdain. He sneered, shaking his head with a tone full of sarcasm. "Your son? Who would have thought an old lady like you would have a son like Captain Thompson?" Mrs. Marjorie was taken aback. Why was he so hostile when he mentioned her son? She didn't understand why this man held such an attitude. An unease began to grow within her. She wanted to stand up and leave, but he stepped closer, blocking her path in a menacing way. She was afraid of being seen, and she was afraid of being seen in a menacing way. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep calm. But the officer didn't move. He stood firmly in front of her, looking her up and down before sneering. "You think you're special just because your son's a captain?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery and contempt. "You think you can walk wherever you want and treat this place like your own just because you're his mother?" Mrs. Marjorie felt fear and confusion flooding her. Each word from the officer hit her like a cold wave, making her feel small and powerless. Why would a police officer say such cruel things? She was just a mother visiting her son, but now she felt as though she was being treated like someone with no right to be here. "I just wanted a little bit of peace," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady, though panic was growing inside her. But her words seemed only to enrage the officer further. He moved closer, his eyes full of threat. "Peace?" He laughed, a chilling sound that made Mrs. Marjorie shudder. "You and people like you think you're above everything because you have family in high places. But let me tell you, here, I make the rules." At that moment, Mrs. Marjorie felt completely threatened. The officer's cold eyes and taunting words left no hope that he would let her go easily. She wanted to stand and leave, but her legs felt locked, unable to move. Tension gripped her, transforming this familiar place into one of dread. Mrs. Marjorie had no idea that today would turn into a nightmare in the very park she cherished. The officer continued to stand there, showing no signs of stepping aside or letting her leave. Instead, his eyes grew darker, his challenging attitude only more apparent. "You think you can do whatever you want because your son's a captain?" he taunted. Pulling a vile, foul-smelling item from his pocket, he shoved it toward her face. "Here, you like moving around freely here, don't you? Then eat this, just to remind yourself of your limits." Mrs. Marjorie recoiled, feeling horror seep through her. She didn't understand why he was acting so violently and bizarrely. Just a moment ago, she'd been a proud mother visiting the park her son protected. But now, she felt like a criminal being humiliated. "I don't want to. Please let me go," she said, her voice shaking, but still trying to remain calm. But the officer didn't care. He sneered, his eyes shining with satisfaction at her fear. "Don't want to? Here, you don't have the right to refuse, understand?" He stepped closer, pressing her against the bench, the revolting item lingering right before her face. The stench made her want to retch, but his hands held her in place, forcing her to confront this terrifying threat. She tried to look away, but the officer's aggression and intimidating demeanor made it impossible not to feel the fear tightening every nerve in her body. "Please," she whispered, hoping he would understand and stop. But the officer only laughed louder, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Please," he mocked. "You think begging will work? No. You and your captain's son need to know you're not special at all." He then shoved the item closer to her, forcing her to take it, while all she could do was sit there, trembling, not daring to resist. She felt each passing second like a heavy weight. All thoughts of safety, of joy, and visiting the park had vanished. She only wanted to escape from this place, from this man, but he seemed determined not to let her go. His abuse of power was all too clear, and she felt utterly helpless in the situation. "Mrs. Marjorie closed her eyes tightly, partly to avoid seeing the disgusting object in front of her, and partly to hold back the fear rising within. In her mind, one thought echoed. "James, where are you? Do you know your mother needs you?" She hoped for a miracle, that her son would appear and take her away from this nightmare. But the officer's coldness, the foul smell, and the looming threat enveloped her, trapping her in a nightmare with no escape. But just then, as if by a miracle, she heard the hurried sound of footsteps on the path in the distance. Her eyes filled with hope, and her heart nearly burst as she recognized the familiar silhouette of her son. Captain James Thompson. Quickly approaching. Captain Thompson recognized his mother from afar, but what he saw made him pause momentarily, his eyes darkening with anger and horror. His beloved mother, whom he cherished and wanted to protect, was sitting on a bench, her face filled with fear, and her hands shaking. "Wow!" The officer in front of her looked aggressive and defiant. He didn't know what had happened, but just seeing his mother's tear-filled eyes told James that she needed him now more than ever. "What's going on here?" Captain Thompson's voice rang out, strong and commanding. He stepped forward, his gaze cold, focusing on the officer before his mother. The officer flinched slightly but tried to keep his composure, though a hint of unease crossed his face. He immediately took a small step back, trying to feign nonchalance, but Captain Thompson's eyes didn't miss the hint of worry in his expression. "Mom, are you all right?" James asked gently, though his voice was firm. He stepped over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder and feeling the tremor through her frail shoulders. Mrs. Marjorie looked up at her son, her eyes tearful, but there was newfound hope in them, the hope that all this horror would end with his presence. She nodded slightly, trying to reassure him, but James saw the fear and hurt clearly in her eyes. He turned to the officer, unable to suppress his anger, his voice turning ice cold. "What exactly did you do to my mother?" The officer cleared his throat, trying to remain calm. "I was just doing my job, Captain." She needed a little reminder not to walk freely in this area. "A reminder?" James repeated, each word laced with restrained fury. "You remind my mother by threatening her and forcing her to eat this?" He pointed to the repulsive item the officer still held. "This is what you call doing your job? Harassing an elderly woman simply because she's my mother?" The officer began to stammer, his eyes shifting, as if looking for an escape from the tension. I thought she needed to know her limits, that no one has the right to move around freely just because they have powerful relatives." He muttered, but in the face of Captain Thompson's piercing gaze, every excuse seemed meaningless. James didn't need to hear more. He looked at the officer with an authoritative glare, his voice cold and final. "You have no right to abuse and threaten citizens like this, especially not someone who has done nothing wrong and is here just to enjoy her time in a public park." The officer tried to hold on to a tough front, but under Captain Thompson's command, he began to show fear. His earlier arrogance and hostility quickly faded, replaced by unease. He took a step back, avoiding James's gaze, but James wouldn't let him get away so easily. "Mom, let me take you home," James said softly to Mrs. Marjorie, squeezing her shoulder gently to comfort her. Mrs. Marjorie nodded, but she couldn't look away from the officer who had caused her such terror in such a short time. But before James could lead her away, he pulled out his radio, his tone firm. "I need assistance. I need assistance at my location. There's a serious case of abuse of power here." He glanced at the officer, his gaze unwavering, causing the officer to grow pale. You can't do that." "I was only doing my job," the officer protested, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had, his words betraying his fear. He knew that this time, his actions wouldn't be so easily overlooked. James ignored his excuses, his gaze steady, his hand still resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. In his eyes there was only anger and a determination to protect his mother, the woman who had silently watched over him and loved him all his life. "Mom, you're going to be all right. It's over now," he whispered to Mrs. Marjorie, his voice filled with reassurance but also a silent promise that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Mrs. Marjorie nodded softly, her heart warmed by her son's protection. Seeing the strength and resolve in James's eyes, she knew she had found not only comfort, but also an unbreakable shield. In his embrace, she knew all the fear had passed, and from now on, she would never have to face such terror alone. A feeling of safety filled Mrs. Marjorie, and she realized that no matter what had happened, her son's love and protection were what gave her strength, even when facing abuse of power and injustice. But for Captain Thompson, this wasn't over. Inside him, a wave of anger simmered at the thought of how the officer had abused his authority and threatened his own mother. He turned to the officer, his voice calm, but with a terrifying firmness. "You will be held accountable for your actions. Here, no one has the right to insult or threaten others, especially not an elderly woman here, simply to enjoy a peaceful time in the park." The officer tried to look nonchalant, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. He knew that going against someone as respected and influential as Captain Thompson had been a grave mistake. His face turned pale, and he began to back away, as if looking for a way out of the situation. But Captain Thompson had no intention of letting him escape easily. Just then, a nearby patrol team responded to his call for backup and arrived. James' colleagues quickly assessed the tense situation, their expression showing clear surprise as they took in the scene with the officer standing there, now in a position of fear. Captain Thompson signaled to his team, then began to recount the events with professional firmness, detailing every action the officer had taken to threaten, coerce, and insult his mother. One of his colleagues spoke up, "We'll handle this immediately, Captain. This behavior is unacceptable." Captain Thompson nodded, feeling his anger ease slightly, knowing that the officer would now face consequences for his actions. He stepped over to his mother, keeping a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Mom, this will be resolved soon. I'll make sure he never has another chance to harm anyone again." The officer, now realizing he had no way out, tried to justify himself. I was only doing my job. I didn't mean to harm her." But Captain Thompson didn't let him finish. "Your job is to protect the public, not to abuse your power to threaten and insult an innocent woman, especially one who only came here to find some peace." His voice was strong, silencing the officer. Those around listened, some visibly shocked and angered by what they had heard from Captain Thompson himself. In those moments, Mrs. Marjorie remained silent. Her gaze calmed, though the feeling of hurt and humiliation lingered. Watching the officer being escorted away, she felt justice was being served, though a trace of sadness stayed with her. How could someone like that be entrusted to protect the community? That question weighed on her mind. "Captain Thompson, would you like us to escort this officer back to headquarters to file a report?" a colleague asked. "Yes, go ahead with that," James responded, his gaze resolute. "I want every one of his actions reported fully to the higher-ups, so no one in our force thinks they have the right to abuse this badge for personal gain." He watched his colleagues escort the officer away, then turned back to his mother. His expression softened. "Mom, let's go home. I'm sorry you had to go through this. This place should have been the safest spot where you always felt peaceful, and instead this happened." Mrs. Marjorie nodded, her eyes still brimming with tears, but she knew her son had handled everything fairly and with strength. This incident revealed another side of him to her, not only as a protector of the community, but also as a defender of his own family, unwilling to tolerate any wrongdoing. "James, I'm proud of you," she said softly, taking his hand. "I know you'll always stand on the side of justice, no matter who it's against." James nodded slightly, a quiet pride swelling within him at her words. He held her hand as they left the park, though a heavy weight still lingered within him. He resolved to do everything he could to prevent such situations from happening again, not only to his mother, but to anyone else in the community he had sworn to protect. As they walked, he knew that today's events were not just an individual's wrongdoing, but a wake-up call to the system itself. Yet, though the matter had passed, an ache remained in James' heart. He couldn't ignore the fact that here in the park, where he served and guarded every day, his beloved mother had endured fear and injustice. The two walked quietly back to James' car. All the way, Mrs. Marjorie was still shaken, her eyes occasionally revealing weariness and pain. Despite trying to stay calm for her son, she couldn't help feeling deeply hurt. The sense of being threatened and disrespected clung to her, casting a shadow over every peaceful memory she had in the park. Once they were seated in the car, James turned to his mother, his gaze gentle, yet tinged with worry. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to go through this. I really can't imagine that the place I worked so hard to protect turned into a place of terror for you." Mrs. Marjorie shook her head, managing a faint smile. "It's not your fault, James. I know you always try to keep everyone safe. But today's incident makes me wonder how many others have gone through what I did without anyone coming to their aid." Listening to his mother's words, James felt an even greater heaviness in his heart. He realized that this wasn't just his mother's pain. It was a shared pain among many others who might have no one to stand up for them. He took her hand, still trembling slightly, a determined look in his eyes, a silent promise that he wouldn't let this happen again. "Mom, I promise you," James said firmly, "I'll do everything I can to stop these abuses of power. I'll ensure that those who misuse authority are held accountable, and no one else has to endure this pain again." Mrs. Marjorie gazed quietly at her son, sensing the resolve in every word he spoke. She knew James kept his promises, and if he vowed something, he would do everything to fulfill it. A mix of pride and gratitude swelled in her heart, though the haunting memory of her moment of helplessness under that officer's cold gaze and demeaning words lingered. "I'll be okay, James," she said softly, trying to reassure him, but both knew that the events wouldn't easily fade. She sat there, letting herself find calm again, but a sense of shame still rose within her, forcing her to take a deep breath to hold back tears. "I'll take you home so you can rest, Mom," James said, his voice still gentle yet filled with resolve. He knew she would need time to overcome her fear, and he wanted to be by her side, even if just to be her support. When they arrived home, James helped his mother out of the car, led her to the living room, and let her settle onto the couch. He got her a glass of water and sat beside her, his hand still holding hers as a reminder that he was always there and would always protect her. After a while, Mrs. Marjorie spoke softly, her voice sad and subdued. "James, do you know what hurts me the most? It's that I lost faith in the place where you work, the place I once believed was a symbol of justice and protection." James felt a pang in his heart at his mother's words. He understood that today's incident had not only hurt her, but also shaken her belief in the values he was fighting to uphold. He couldn't deny that the system he served had its flaws, and his mother's suffering today was stark evidence of that. "I understand, Mom," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "That's also why I'm determined to change this. I won't just protect you, but I'll protect those who have no one to lean on, those who might silently endure injustices." Mrs. Marjorie smiled gently, her gaze softening as she listened to her son. "I know you'll do it, James. I always believe in you, and I trust that you'll bring about good change." Her words gave James renewed strength. He looked deep into his mother's eyes, where he saw steadfastness and faith. In that moment, he promised himself he wouldn't let her pain be in vain. From today onward, he would do everything to protect the vulnerable and help restore trust in justice and a fairer system. The two of them sat in silence, filled with emotion. Although today's events left lasting scars, their love and family bond helped them find the strength to move forward. Together, they knew they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next day, news of Mrs. Marjorie's encounter with the abusive officer quickly spread throughout the community. Stories of her unfair treatment and the public's anger became topics of conversation everywhere, from friends in the neighborhood to other families in the city. Everyone was shocked that an elderly woman had been subjected to such humiliation by the very person who was supposed to protect her. Mrs. Marjorie was a quiet woman, seldom sharing personal matters. But as her story spread, she received countless messages and calls from neighbors, friends, and even strangers expressing sympathy and solidarity. Those who had seen her stroll through the park or sit under the large tree with a warm cup of tea couldn't believe that one day she'd been forced to face cruelty in a place she cherished. Mrs. Marjorie was moved by the community's support. Every question of concern and message of compassion became a great comfort, raising her humiliation and fear. It wasn't just sympathy. It was also a collective belief in justice that the officer's actions would be condemned and rightfully punished. She no longer felt alone or helpless. In her pain, she realized she had not only her family but an entire community beside her. What touched her most was a call from a young woman named Linda. She shared that she, too, had been a victim of abuse of authority, but had suffered in silence because no one stood up for her. Mrs. Marjorie's story had inspired her to speak out so that no one else would have to endure injustice in silence. "Thanks to you, I realized I don't have to be silent," Linda said over the phone, her voice filled with emotion. "Your story has shown me that no one should face injustice alone. Thank you for your courage in speaking up." Hearing these words, Mrs. Marjorie felt a profound sense of empathy. What had happened to her was not just a sad story of her own, but had become a source of encouragement for others. A new resolve rose within her, not only to protect herself, but to inspire those around her to stand up for justice. If her story could help someone else feel stronger, then her pain would not be in vain. In the following days, Mrs. Marjorie's story received attention from social organizations and the media. The press began covering the story, and social media was flooded with posts demanding justice for her. Strangers and families who had also faced similar injustices voiced their support and called for reform in the system. They wanted to ensure that no one else would have to suffer the same humiliation as Mrs. Marjorie. Captain Thompson received numerous messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers expressing admiration for how he had protected his mother and promising to stand with him in his fight for a better justice system. James felt this unity like an invisible force, a confirmation that he was not alone in this mission. One morning, when James took his mother back to the park so she could walk peacefully without fear, they met several residents who came to greet and support them. They said that James' actions had rekindled their faith in justice and courage within the community. They thanked Mrs. Marjorie for not staying silent, for having the courage to tell her story and motivate others. Mrs. Marjorie looked at the people who greeted her, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She hadn't expected to receive so much love and support. The warm words of everyone made her feel as though the park had returned to be in the peaceful and safe place she once loved. After that morning, Mrs. Marjorie began to feel stronger. No longer was she the elderly woman forced to sit in silence. She had become a symbol of resilience and the will to stand against injustice. She knew that with the community by her side, she would never have to face her pain alone. This incident showed her her own strength and the value of speaking up and community solidarity. Now, she felt renewed faith in justice and a determination stronger than ever. She was no longer the woman who suffered in silence, but a part of a wave of change, someone who inspired others to stand up for themselves and fight for a fair society. Recognizing the impact of Mrs. Marjorie's story, the local government decided to establish a Mau Community Advisory Board to oversee issues related to public safety and citizens' rights in law enforcement activities. Mrs. Marjorie, who had once been a victim of abuse of power but had risen to fight, was quickly invited to join this advisory board. When she received the invitation, she was surprised, but a sense of pride and determination filled her heart. "James, do you think I should do it?" she asked her son, her voice hesitant, but her eye sparkled with hope. Captain Thompson smiled, taking her hand. "Mom, you've already become an inspiration to so many people. Your presence will reassure everyone that we are truly working for the benefit of all. I'm proud of you." With her son's encouragement and the community's support, Mrs. Marjorie accepted the role. When she officially joined the Community Advisory Board, a new wave of support and hope arose. The community trusted that with Mrs. Marjorie, who had endured such pain, stories of abuse of power would be taken seriously and addressed with greater urgency. In the first few weeks, Mrs. Marjorie attended meetings with representatives from the government, police and non-profit organizations. She listened to each story and concern, especially from those who had faced abuses of power and felt a great responsibility on her shoulders. In the past, she was just an elderly mother visiting her son at the park. But now, she was a voice for the voiceless. Someone who would speak up to ensure no one else had to endure the same injustice. In an important meeting of the advisory board, a police representative spoke about their commitment to reform, emphasizing increased training and ethics checks within the force. Mrs. Marjorie, with her painful experience, spoke up to share her feelings and remind them of the importance of compassion and respect. "Power is not something to be abused," she said, her voice soft yet clear. "Ordinary people like me, like all of us here, only want to live in a fair society where those granted power use it to protect, not to threaten." Her words created a moment of silence in the room, with delegates and police representatives listening intently. Some even bowed their heads, as if reflecting on their responsibilities. Once, someone who felt helpless and afraid, Mrs. Marjorie had become a symbol of determination and justice. Her presence, as someone who had suffered, brought a new meaning to the meetings, reminding everyone of the need for reform. As time passed, Mrs. Marjorie's involvement in the Community Advisory Board brought about positive changes. She not only listened, but also contributed to the development of new policies, pushing for stricter regulations on police conduct and establishing a hotline for citizens to report injustices. Along with other members, she worked to gradually restore the community's trust in law enforcement, creating an environment where everyone was treated fairly and respectfully. She also became a guest speaker at community gatherings, sharing her story and encouraging people not to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing and injustice. Each time she stood before a crowd, she saw the strength in every supportive look and desire for change in the audience. She knew that she was no longer fighting alone, that her pain had become motivation for an entire community. With Mrs. Marjorie's dedication, the community no longer saw her as just an elderly mother, but as a hero, a powerful voice ready to stand up for change. Positive changes gradually spread, and people began to feel safe when thinking about the police force. Trust was restored, and Mrs. Marjorie knew she had contributed to that. After a long advisory board meeting, a board member approached her, eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks to you, we've realized that true strength lies not in power, but in compassion and justice. Thank you for your courage in speaking out and guiding us down this path." Mrs. Marjorie smiled, a gentle but resolute smile. She knew that this journey was far from over, but with the support of her family, friends, and community, she would not stop. She had found a new purpose in her life, and from now on, she would continue to use her voice to ensure that everyone was treated with justice and compassion. With this turning point, Mrs. Marjorie had transformed her pain into strength to improve her community, and she knew she would never give up until everyone felt safe, respected, and protected in their own home. As time passed, Mrs. Marjorie's efforts with the Community Advisory Board created significant changes in the city. Reforms expanded beyond police conduct to raise community awareness about individual rights and responsibilities. Her story inspired many people to stand up for what was right, creating a positive ripple effect. One evening, at a ceremony honoring the contributions of individuals and organizations to the community, Mrs. Marjorie was invited to speak on stage. Standing before the crowd, seeing so many admiring and grateful faces, she felt a warm, invisible strength fill her heart. It wasn't just pride, but an acknowledgement of a difficult yet meaningful journey she had shared with the community. She took the microphone, her voice calm yet resonant, a message for everyone present and future generations. "The changes we've achieved today aren't due to one person, but the strength and faith of all of us. The pain I endured showed me that silence is never the solution, and only when we speak up together can justice reach every corner of society. I believe that any of us, whoever we are, can become a leader if we dare to stand up for what is right." Applause echoed throughout the room, filled with gratitude and admiration. Many stood, clapping continuously. Seeing the crowd's reaction, Mrs. Marjorie felt that all the pain and suffering she had once endured had been repaid. That pain had become a flame, inspiring others to build a fairer society. James, sitting in the front row, looked at his mother with pride and love. To him, Mrs. Marjorie was not just his mother, but a symbol of resilience, someone who helped him realize the profound meaning of serving justice. He knew her journey had changed his life, helping him see the true value of his work. In that moment, he silently promised that he would continue to serve, protect the ideals his mother had championed, and pass them on to him. After the ceremony, Mrs. Marjorie and her son walked out of the hall. Several people approached to thank her, sharing that they had learned so much from her story and, because of her, had found the courage to face life's injustices. She held their hands tightly, offering sincere encouragement and assuring them that, together, they could overcome anything. As the two walked away, the streetlights illuminated their path, lighting up the way ahead. Mrs. Marjorie knew her journey was not yet over, that there was still much to be done to protect and uphold justice. But, with the support of her family, friends, and community, she knew she would never be alone. She had left a lasting mark on everyone's hearts, a legacy of courage and resilience, and she believed those values would continue to be passed down to future generations. As she walked with her son, Mrs. Marjorie smiled, a smile filled with faith and peace. Though the storm of injustice had once entered her life, she had turned it into a source of strength to help others. Now, looking toward the future, she was confident that the changes she had helped create would be the foundation for a better society, one where justice and compassion were always upheld. With a bright hope in her heart, she knew she had completed a meaningful mission, and she would forever be a symbol of resilience, compassion, and justice in everyone's hearts. This story of Mrs. Marjorie overcoming pain and injustice, turning it into strength to spread belief in justice and compassion throughout the community, reminds us that even in adversity, each person can create change when they bravely stand for what is right and unite for a common goal. We hope this story serves as a reminder that the power of one individual can make a difference, and when we stand together, a better future is always within reach. Please subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this, helping to spread positive values and contribute to building a fairer and more compassionate community. Thank you for being with us.